Imagine walking down a noisy, filthy, overcrowded Manhattan street in the 1850s. Horses clattered on cobblestones. Immigrants, freshly landed from Ireland, struggled to stay alive, while native-born working-class men swaggered beneath gas lamps. Now, imagine turning a corner and running straight into a gang fight. Not with switchblades or handguns, but with bricks, clubs, brickbats, axes, even muskets scavenged from pawn shops. This wasn't fiction. This was the real gangs of New York. Today, we're plunging into the story of the Bowery Boys and the Dead Rabbits, two of the most notorious street gangs of 19th century Manhattan, locked in pitched battles on the cobblestones, culminating in what many historians call America's First Street War. To understand why the Bowery Boys and the Dead Rabbits fought, you have to understand the environment that birthed them. Mid-19th century NYC was exploding with change. Between 1820 and 1860, hundreds of thousands of Irish immigrants poured into the city, many fleeing the devastation of the Great Famine. They arrived desperate, penniless, and distrusted by native-born Americans who saw them as competitors for jobs, housing, and political power. At the same time, Manhattan was a tinderbox. Rapid industrialization drew young men into cramped neighborhoods already overflowing. With little police presence, the modern NYPD was only just being organized in 1845. Mutual protection societies often morphed into gangs. Some offered real protection, others extortion, and many existed somewhere in between. Turf wars became inevitable. At the same time, nativists in top hats. The Bowery Boys weren't just a street gang, they were a cultural identity. They were native-born, mostly second- or third-generation Americans, young working-class men who prided themselves on being nativists, meaning they opposed immigrant groups, especially the Irish Catholics. They dressed distinctively: stovepipe hats, red firemen's shirts, cravats, and polished boots. Many Bowery Boys were volunteer firefighters, and firefighting in Old New York wasn't just about public service, it was a political and gang-related identity. Fire companies were tribal, and when a fire alarm rang, rival fire brigades sometimes fought each other for the privilege of putting it out. Bragging rights and control meant everything. The Bowery Boys embodied this culture of swagger, street fighting, and aggressive nativism. Toughness at 5 points now to their great rivals, the Dead Rabbits, a predominantly Irish gang rooted in the 5 Points slum. 5 Points was infamous even then, one of the worst urban slums in America. Muddy streets choked with garbage, ramshackle wooden housing packed with families on the edge of survival. It was a place of constant tension, but also of cultural invention. Music, dance, and early forms of tap and shuffle. The Dead Rabbits weren't polished. They were tough, ragged, hardened by hungers and anti-Irish prejudice. Behind their name lies folklore. One popular story says a dead rabbit was once thrown into the middle of a gang meeting, interpreted as a sign from the heavens. Another theory, rabbit meant desperate. Either way, their reputation was clear. The Dead Rabbits were fierce street fighters, armed with clubs, cleavers, and pistols whenever they could be found. Tammany Hall. Neither gang existed in a vacuum. New York politics in the mid-19th century was a swamp of corruption and patronage, dominated by Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine. Tammany saw the Irish as a powerful new voting bloc, and they relied on gangs like the Dead Rabbits to mobilize crowds, intimidate rivals, and get out the vote on Election Day. On the other side, many Bowery Boys associated with nativist movements, including the Know Nothing Party, which sought to curb Catholic immigration. Gang fights were never just random. They reflected the broader battle for political and cultural supremacy in New York. For young men in 1850s New York, gang membership was often less about crime for profit than about identity, survival, and belonging. The Bowery Boys patrolled their turf uptown, proud of their style, quick to start fights with Irish laborers. The Dead Rabbits controlled slices of the 5 Points and nearby neighborhoods. Rival saloons acted as headquarters, where drinking, gambling, and scheming filled the hours. Fights could erupt over insults, political rallies, or theater performances. Yes, even the theater. This was the era when Astor Place riot of 1849, sparked by rival Shakespearean actors and inflamed by class division, left more than 20 dead. Violence was in the air. The Dead Rabbits Riot, July 4-5, 1857. The showdown came to a head in July 1857, remembered as the Dead Rabbits Riot. Like so many fights, it began small. On July 4, 1857, a group of Dead Rabbits clashed with the Bowery Boys. By the next day, the fight escalated into one of the largest gang riots in American history up to that point. Thousands descended onto Bayard Street. The battle raged with bricks, clubs, iron bars, knives, and even muskets. Some accounts describe bands of 50 or 60 men at a time charging each other in the streets. Buildings were sacked, windows smashed, shops looted. It wasn't just gangs anymore, it became a full-scale urban riot. Police attempted to intervene but were overwhelmed. For 2 days, Lower Manhattan was under the shadow of chaos, aftermath, and consequences. By the time order was restored, at least 8 were dead, and dozens, possibly hundreds, were injured. Damage stretched across multiple blocks. The riot shocked the city's elites, forcing conversations about crime, policing, and immigrant integration. Importantly, this was not the end of the gangs. Both the Bowery Boys and Dead Rabbits persisted through the late 1850s and into the Civil War era, when another eruption, the draft riots of 1863, would dwarf even this conflict. But the Dead Rabbits Riot marked a turning point. Proof that New York's gang wars were more than neighborhood squabbles. They reflected the deep divides of class, religion, and ethnicity shaping America's largest city. The legend and the legacy. Although the gangs faded by the late 19th century, their cultural impact lingered. They inspired sensational newspaper accounts, penny dreadfuls, and, eventually, modern storytelling. Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York famously dramatized them, blending fact and fiction, though historians caution us about accuracy. What's clear is that the Bowery Boys and Dead Rabbits represented more than hooligans. They embodied the anxieties of immigration, the fragility of urban order, and the violent youth culture that New York fostered. Their riot of July 1857 remains an early test case in how America grappled with pluralism, poverty, and power on its cobblestone streets. America's first street war. So, when we call the battle between the Bowery Boys and Dead Rabbits America's first street war, we capture more than one bloody riot. We capture the way gangs, politics, and identity collided in a young, restless nation. These weren't just fights over turf, they were struggles over who belonged in the American city. And through fire, brick, and blood, the streets of Manhattan told that story. And that was the Battle of the Bowery Boys and the Dead Rabbits, America's very first street war. But this was only the beginning. Within a few years, New York would be torn apart again, this time by the Civil War draft riots of 1863. Riots so massive, they made the Dead Rabbits clash look like a tavern brawl. If you want to see just how far the chaos went, click right here and join me for the next chapter in New York's violent history. Trust me, you won't look at the city streets the same way again.